Hello my loves, I'm Sarah Louise of Brightwitch. On this channel we'll be talking about consciousness, creativity, and the craft of magical living. In my last video, I hinted at the idea that consciousness may not be quite as confined within our brains as we might think. Today we'll be having a tea and a chat about consciousness and why I believe our minds are more expansive, perhaps even more magical, than our mainstream understandings of psychology and neurology. Join me as we scratch at the surface of consciousness. What is consciousness? Where does the awareness of our own experiences, the awareness of being aware, come from? In the last century, and especially the last handful of decades, the sciences of psychology, psychiatry, and neurology have made incredible strides in our understanding of the brain, of its structures and functions, and of the various patterns of electrical activity which thread together our mind, brain, and body. Thanks to technologies like the EEG, which measures the brain's electrical activity, as well as neuroimaging technology, we've been able to gather a wealth of data about the brain. We've also been able to witness the difference between brains capable of consciousness, as well as brains which appear incapable of conscious activity due to damage or injury. These kinds of inquiries into the biological markers of consciousness are incredibly important, especially for medical decision-making. We know from decades worth of research and medical practice that when certain regions of the brain are damaged or even wholly removed, a person's sense of self-awareness and sense of identity may be completely unaffected. For example, people who have had hemispherectomies as children to treat severe epilepsy have grown into high-functioning adults leading quite normal lives. Yet when other regions of the brain are damaged, conscious experience appears impossible, leading to deep coma or even death. It also appears that the brain's plasticity, its ability to change in structure, allows for some level of compensation for the loss of other structures, enabling conscious awareness and cognitive functioning up to a point. We're still not precisely exactly sure what that point might be, although research within the last few years may be zeroing in on identifying more specific networks of brain regions which function together with the brainstem to heavily impact consciousness. So all in all, we do know that the brain plays a vital role in our living experience of consciousness, of sustaining presence of mind and identity, and in crafting meaningful perceptions of the world around us. But even with all our current knowledge in brain science, no one knows for sure exactly how or even why the brain gives rise to consciousness. Yet it would seem logical to assume that neuronal structures and patterns of electricity are the exclusive sum of consciousness. And this is what I believed for many years. There appears little room in this model of brain science for spiritual notions of identity or transcendent consciousness. As a child, as many of us did, I adored the notions of angels and fey creatures, of the world having a fundamentally magical heartbeat beneath the curtain of the material world. But as I grew older, I was exposed to more and more scientific literature on the nature of cognition, and the idea of spirits and transcendental eternal souls made less and less sense to me. Science had appeared to close the gap on such superstition, and any belief to the contrary appeared to be fantasies of perception. By my mid-20s, my own beliefs and even the possibility of a spirit realm had all but shut off. It was evident to me and the mainstream purview that the architecture of the cosmos was an accidental miracle of an infinity of improbabilities. Random collisions between randomly distributed particles formed elements which chained themselves into molecules, which assembled into proteins, which began to structure into information-dense, self-replicating organic materials, which evolved into increasingly complex organisms that consumed baser resources to perpetuate the agenda of their own life, who then grew into animate beings capable of increasingly complex cognitive abilities, cognizance, self-awareness, consciousness. How does non-living, non-conscious matter spin itself into biological machines which care about their own identity and form? Why should any form of this nature become aware of its own form, let alone care about the preservation of form? Where lies the threshold between unconscious molecules collecting randomly and responding automatically to microscopic, non-living forces which compel the mechanical action of biological functioning and the utter enigma of self-awareness. It would make some logical sense that there is no threshold at all. On the secular side of this coin, the complexity of life and form is a happy, unwitting accident of action and reaction, the cause and effect of random collisions between matter and energy over the span of billions of years, in which case our own self-awareness is an illusory byproduct of chemistry and electricity, a happenstance trick of sensory perception. On the other side of that coin is the idea of panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is actually a fundamental property of the universe, the most fundamental property, governing the fields of probability which birth energy and matter, which then interact in minuscule packets of intelligent information, spinning upwards into life with increasingly complex agenda. Given the science I'd been exposed to at the time, the secular mainstream perspective seemed like the most rational, logical conclusion, perhaps even the only logical conclusion. But it wasn't enough for me. Over time, I found it increasingly difficult to connect with a sense of purpose behind my ambitions. I became increasingly disoriented by the scale of my own life, my identity, accomplishments and potential in life within the context of a near infinite universe. I tried my best to rein in my perspective and focus on what mattered in human terms: a life well lived, connecting with loved ones, the building of material security and comforts, the exploration of new delightful experiences, and the pursuit of projects which appealed to my interests. But I couldn't quite shake this little voice which weighed down on top of it all, that kept whispering, "But what's the point?" I couldn't lose this sense of countdown against my life. I knew I could never have enough time to experience all that I wanted to explore, or make everything I wanted to create, or learn everything I wanted to know. And at least subconsciously, this filled me with a tremendous sense of sadness, which, try as I did to struggle against it, led to a deeper and deeper sense of apathy. One day, on a kind of absurd whim, I googled something like "proof magic is real." I felt silly even typing it out because, of course, magic didn't exist, not in the sense of mythic wizards and high elves. But I was driven to find something more in life, some kind of stabilizing connection with the nature of the world that would help orient me in my own life. Among the search results, I found a book called Real Magic by parapsychologist Dean Radin, who is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Parapsychology is the study of what's known as psi phenomena, abilities of extrasensory perception like clairvoyance, telepathy, and even psychokinesis. Basically, the perception of information outside of the usual parameters of the five senses and space and time, as well as mind-matter interaction. Abilities many of us would think would fall into the realm of magic, or at least fantasy. In this book, I read Radin's accounts of his research and lab experiments, and I was taken aback. Going into the book, I was deeply skeptical to the point of pessimism, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't also deeply excited by the idea of scientific evidence for magical abilities. Radin's presentation of his research throughout the book was, to my mind, logical, well-reasoned, and quite measured in tone. Whereas I suppose I was expecting something a little more evangelical in nature. I'm not a scientist, but to my layperson's skepticism, the results of Radin's research seem to offer pretty compelling evidence for the idea that our consciousness, through directed attention, directly impacts material reality. The most famous example of this idea is that of the double slit experiment. In this experiment, a laser is used to project light through a partition with two slits. The light impacts a screen on the other side of this partition, and the hit position of this energy is recorded. Light is composed of electromagnetic energy, which can behave as either a wave or condense into discrete particles of energy called photons. If the electromagnetic energy functions as a wave, the energy travels through both slits at once, creating something like ripples as the energy from the two slits re-interact on the other side of the partition. The interaction then creates an interference pattern against the screen, as the peaks and troughs of this energy either combine together or cancel each other out. However, if the electromagnetic energy travels through the slit as a photon particle, it registers a distinct position against the screen, having traveled through either one or the other slit, not both at the same time as it would in waveform. It was found that if it is not known which of the two slits a photon will travel through, the energy registers as a wave. If it is known by any means which slit a photon traveled through, then the energy registers as a particle. RADIN was interested to find out whether human consciousness had any impact on how the light energy registered, either as a wave or a particle. His research team engaged participants who were instructed to focus their mind's eye on the path of the photons as the light was fired against the slits. This was to be done purely in their imagination. The participants were fitted with EEGs to record their brain activity, which was able to show when their attention was focused and when it wasn't. The findings showed that when participants concentrated their attention on tracking the path of the photon, a discrete particle was registered. When they relaxed their attention, the energy registered as waves. Participants included experienced meditators as well as people who didn't meditate. RADIN's research found that meditators were able to sustain their attention for longer than non-meditators, and therefore yielded more significant results. To rule out the possibility that participant behavior around the machine might in some way influence the outcome of this experiment, RADIN expanded his experiment to include online participants who were in no way physically proximal to the machine. People from all around the world participated in this experiment, and it was found that significant results were measured regardless of distance. From this research, RADIN concluded that there was indeed a mind-matter interaction which was dictated by attention, and weirder still, an interaction which seemed independent of proximity. So consciousness seems to impact energy and matter on a quantum scale, but what about on a larger scale? Another experiment RADIN conducted involved two participants who were kept in separate rooms on different levels of adjacent buildings. One participant, who was referred to as Mulder, was given a doll figure which represented the other participant, who was referred to as Scully. Scully was fitted with equipment to measure biological activity like heart rate, blood volume pulse, and electrodermal activity, which is the electrical conductivity of the skin related to changes in the activity of sweat glands. Mulder's task was to first make a mental connection between Scully and the doll figure, which was accompanied by a written bio and photographs of Scully, and then direct positive intentions towards the doll, mimicking in their minds giving it a neck or back rub, or otherwise intending to reduce stress. Mulder was instructed as to when it was time to send intentions and when it was time to stop, and Scully's biological data was examined against this instructed timeline. It was found that during the times Mulder sent intentions, Scully's physiology responded. Blood volume pulse increased and heart rate decreased, both consistent with a relaxation response. However, in some of the experimental sessions, there was also an increase in electrodermal activity. Normally this activity should decrease as a person relaxes. When the Mulder participants for these sessions were questioned as to how they were interacting with the doll, it was found that these participants were physically massaging or otherwise stroking the face and hair of the doll. RADIN then decided to measure what happens physiologically during an actual hands-on massage. He found that electrodermal activity increased, blood volume pulse increased, and heart rate decreased. So results consistent with what was measured during the sessions where the Mulder participants were physically interacting with the doll. So it appears that attention and intention can have a distant physiological impact on a person, even if channeled through an abstract representation like a doll. Interesting. There were a number of other truly fascinating experiments detailed in Real Magic, so I'll include the link to the book in the description box below so that you can have a read if you're interested. After reading this book, I was fairly convinced, at least in theory, that our minds are capable of far more than I certainly thought possible. But a part of me was still pretty dubious. However, not long after I finished this book, my friends and I traveled to New Orleans, where I had what I believe to be a genuinely supernatural encounter. At least I couldn't explain it by any conventional understanding. I spoke about this experience in my last video, which I'll also link in the description below if you'd like to check it out. This very personal, even visceral experience really helped to solidify RADIN's findings into something of a more tangible reality for me. It lit a fire in me to keep digging into the nature of consciousness and begin considering that there might indeed be facets of the world that I'd previously dismissed as the mind playing tricks or outright nonsense. This information was very exciting and fascinating to me because it felt like the world was truly magical. Our minds not only impact our own bodies, but also, it seems, substances, other people, even the fabric of reality. As I read even further into these kinds of topics, I could feel a part of myself almost re-inflating, balancing me out and bringing me back down to earth as the world's possibilities expanded. But this still didn't fully assuage my existential anxieties. All of these capabilities, remarkable as they are, still seemed very rooted in brain function. At least, there was nothing specifically about these phenomena which suggested that consciousness existed independently of the brain, even if the scope of our minds seems independent of distance. Despite my own ghostly experience, I still wasn't really sure what that actually meant for consciousness. Then I came across the story of neurosurgeon EBEN Alexander in his book Proof of Heaven. His story is at least medically remarkable. He appeared to spontaneously develop an incredibly rare and incredibly severe case of bacterial meningitis, an infection which spread to his brain, and he rapidly fell into a natural coma. He was then also kept in a medically induced coma for a number of days after to mitigate any further damage. Since bacterial meningitis attacks the neocortex, the structure of the brain which is understood to be responsible for sensory perception such as vision and hearing, as well as abstract thinking, memory, and emotional responses, Alexander claims that the severity of his infection effectively took his neocortex offline. This is an important detail. During Alexander's coma, he recalls experiencing an incredibly vivid, what he calls realer than real, journey to a seeming spirit realm of incredible beauty. During this experience, he met a beautiful woman who was unknown to him, who acted as something of a guide through this exquisite hyperreal landscape. As Alexander's coma persisted over days, the chances of his recovery grew increasingly unlikely. The longer the coma and infection persisted, the more negligible his chances of ever waking, let alone retaining cognitive functioning if he ever did wake. However, on the 7th day, Alexander awoke from his coma and went on to make a full recovery with apparently no lasting deficits. If not a medical miracle, then certainly a unique medical improbability. After his recovery, Alexander recounted his experiences to those close to him, including a detailed description of the beautiful woman he'd met on the other side. While he was personally amazed by his own experience, he was also deeply disappointed that he hadn't met anyone whom he'd known and loved in life, such as his father. He had no idea who the woman he'd met was. The thing is, Alexander had never known his biological family. Adopted as a baby, Alexander had spent the majority of his life without contact with his birth parents. It turns out that he actually had several biological siblings whom he'd never met. Eventually, he was able to make contact with his family, and a few months after awakening from his coma, one of Alexander's sisters sent him a packet of photos. His other biological sister, Betsy, had died some years prior. Included in the packet of photos was a photograph of Betsy. On opening these photos, Alexander immediately recognized the photo of Betsy as the woman he'd met during his coma. While I found a number of things a little frustrating about this story as I was reading through it, this particular detail fascinated me as it lent something of an objective tether to Alexander's experience. I was a bit skeptical of the book overall, as it had clearly been written with narrative in mind, and I wondered if aspects had perhaps been embellished for drama. But it sent me down another path to the work of Peter Fenwick, a neuropsychiatrist and neurophysiologist who had spent much of his career studying end-of-life and near-death phenomena. I watched an interview with Fenwick titled "What Really Happens When You Die," where he speaks about his studies and his own personal views of consciousness, which are informed by his findings. Early in his career, Fenwick thought that near-death experiences, or NDEs, were a load of nonsense, until his own patients started reporting them. He became curious about these experiences and began to research them further. In the 1980s, he conducted a letter survey where participants wrote in their experiences. This was particularly interesting information as there was hardly any mainstream awareness about NDEs, so The general public wasn't primed for what these experiences should be like. He also studied the NDEs of patients who had experienced heart failure. These cases were especially interesting as measurable brain activity stops within 20 to 40 seconds of the heart stopping, so NDE experiences shouldn't be possible for the brain to produce after this time. Fenwick found that there was a component of NDEs which was heavily influenced by culture, and yet there also appeared to be a consistent pattern to NDEs which was fairly common regardless of culture. For example, the structure of an NDE can often start with an out-of-body experience where the patient leaves their body and is able to witness the events happening around them. Then there appears to be a transition or journey to some ideal place where the patient might meet past relatives and loved ones. Sometimes there is also a sort of life review. And then there appears to be a threshold of no return, which, if crossed, will result in final death. The actual content of these experiences seems to be informed by culture. For example, in Christian cultures, it's quite common to travel through a tunnel of white light and perceive angelic beings. However, in Japanese culture, patients might come to a river which they then have to find some way across. One man in a more hunter-gatherer type of society reported an NDE which consisted of a 3-day journey paddling up a river until he arrived at an idyllic, paradise-like island. NDEs can also have a lasting impact on the patient's life perspective thereafter, creating a sense of peace and appeasing fears surrounding death. But how do we know these experiences are real and not just the final hallucinogenic product of a brain starved of oxygen, or otherwise wholly produced by the brain in the moments just before or just after the brain shuts down? Well, Fenwick also did a study of hospice workers and found that there were a number of strange phenomena witnessed around dying patients. The patients themselves, in the moments leading up to their death, appeared to perceive deathbed visitors. Long-dead relatives and loved ones come back to guide them and ease their transition into death. And some of these spiritual visitors were also witnessed by living visitors, such as relatives and friends. Children in particular seemed more likely to witness these seeming spirit apparitions. There were also quite common reports of light filling the rooms as patients died. This light was reported to have a distinct spiritual quality to it, and could be witnessed by family members and sometimes even the hospice nurses. In his study, Fenwick found that about 35% of hospice nurses reported witnessing this light in the rooms of the dying, or otherwise hearing of this light in conversations with relatives. Sometimes shapes would be seen leaving the bodies of the dying. Sometimes they were definite forms, and other times they had a more mirage-like or smoky quality to their appearance. Clocks were also reported as stopping at the time of a patient's death. In these instances, it didn't appear to matter whether the clock was digital or analog. Fenwick himself recalls travelling to the home of a man whose brother had just died to inform him of the man's passing. As Fenwick arrived at the home, the brother told him he already knew of his brother's passing, as all of the clocks in his house had stopped at the time of death. Sometimes visitations are also reported by loved ones, as those who have just recently passed appear to say goodbye or to offer comfort to the living. Fenwick recounts the story of a woman who had perceived the form of her son, who had appeared before her dripping wet to tell her that he was fine and not to worry about him. It turns out that her son had drowned. At this time, her son had drowned in England, and yet she herself was residing in Australia at the time of the visitation. Fenwick himself subscribes to the idea that the brain does not produce consciousness, but rather filters it from a greater source. He believes that our brains interact with consciousness, computing it into what we perceive as individualized awareness. Other research has also been done into the out-of-body experience component of near-death experiences. One study, published by Jeffrey Long, looks at the lines of evidence for these experiences. One line of evidence reports that 45% of patients who had experienced an out-of-body experience during their NDE saw and heard the events surrounding their body from a completely different vantage point of perspective. They were then able to describe the full details of their resuscitation with remarkable accuracy, which begs the question, how could a brain which is producing no measurable activity accurately perceive the linear chronological events around them during this non-active period of time? There have also been reports of near-death experiences in patients who were born legally blind who, upon leaving their body during an NDE, experienced vision for the first time. One such story is that of Marta, a 5-year-old girl who was born legally blind, who waded into a lake and began to drown. After losing consciousness, she recounts seeing a woman dressed in white light. She also recounts traveling around the lake environment and seeing crystal clear details like the leaves of trees and bird feathers. During her NDE, Marta was capable of visually perceiving the details outside of her body that was impossible while inside her body. This particular study concludes that NDEs are medically inexplicable and cannot be explained by known physical brain function. So what are we truly to make of all this? On the one hand, consciousness in living people appears to depend on particular brain functions, yet our minds seem to be capable of influencing material reality well beyond the proximal reaches of our brains. We also not only have accounts of people retaining a sense of individualized perspective and perception during out-of-body experiences, but also experiencing a quality of perception that their physiology is incapable of. Additionally, we have observer accounts of seeming spiritual entities retaining the appearance of the identity they'd had in life after the death of the brain and body. As for myself, based on the materials that I've read and my own personal experiences, I can't help but believe that consciousness interacts deeply with our brain and yet also exists independently of it, that we as conscious beings persist after death. The ideas around panpsychism started to make more sense to me than the idea of a fundamentally dead universe with tiny accidental pockets of illusory consciousness. The more I learned, the more my anxieties surrounding the idea that death is the end of conscious experience and identity began to subside. And now I have so many questions that I want to explore. Like, why do we still seem to retain an individualized sense of personality after death? Why, during out-of-body experiences, do we perceive information about the world in a way that is consistent with our animal physiological senses like sight and hearing? Or is that the only information we retain on waking because it matches our senses? What new dimensions does this add to our psychology in the question of nature versus nurture? Do our brains dictate our personalities? Or do we rather channel our personalities from some greater pattern within consciousness? Or is it a little of both? These questions no longer cause me existential distress, but rather engage a deep sense of awe and curiosity. I hope that this T-Chat has offered the same kind of experience for you. Let me know down in the comments what you think of all this. Do you think this is all pseudoscience which has been misinterpreted and misrepresented, as some skeptics do believe? Or does this confirm what you already believe? Have new possibilities been opened up for you? I'd love to know your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining me for this tea time journey. If you'd like to see more of this kind of content in your feed, give Madam Algorithm a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos from me in future, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell. Until next time, much love. Science. Fly away, dust. In a world of pure imagination. The participants were fitted. Oh my god, leaf blower man, no. I want to go live in the woods far away from society. It turns... No.